Hello and welcome to what I believe is module 14 of the course, and we're going to be talking about making weight for powerlifting today. We're going to cover all sorts of topics from being able to pick the right weight class in the first place, understanding what body composition that requires, if someone should move down a weight class or up a weight class or stay where they are. And then we'll look at how you would manipulate body composition in the long term, and then acutely, so in the few days leading up to a meet, some weight cutting strategies that can be both safe and effective, that can allow you to make weight for your weight class without necessary dips in performance. And then we'll round off by some typical things you should probably consider for your meet day nutrition. So what you should be consuming after you've made weight and throughout the day of a meet. So before we get into it, just as a recap for stuff I said in the previous module, for maybe some of you jumping into this one, my name is Danny Lennon. I run a company called Sigma Nutrition, and we talk about evidence-based nutrition for health and performance. I have a background with a master's in nutritional sciences, undergraduate in biology and physics, and a lot of my work as a practitioner over the years has been based around weight class based sports. So I've done a lot of work with professional MMA athletes, professional boxers, judo, taekwondo, and then also in strength sport as well. So most notably in powerlifting, but also some Olympic weightlifters as well. But we currently at Sigma Nutrition handle a lot of the nutrition for many competitive powerlifters, and we'll hopefully try and give some of that experience across in this discussion today. So if you want to ask me any questions about anything covered in this module or the previous module, then feel free to either contact me on social media, as you see on the screen now, or at the email address provided. So to get into this, as a recap of what I discussed previously in the other fundamental nutrition module, was when we consider changes in body mass, so your weight that's going to be on a scale, there's kind of two components we can look at. One is changing actual body tissue, and that is two components. That's changing the amount of fat mass that you have and or changing the amount of muscle mass you have. And in the last module, we went through how you might set up a dieting phase to decrease the amount of body fat an athlete may have. Today, we're going to talk about if we're trying to gain some muscle mass and maybe move up in weight, how we might go about that. So both these changes in body tissue are what we're going to refer to as body composition changes. And this would be changes that would be reflected in the scale weight, but it happen over a longer period of time. So many weeks and months, we are changing these. When we talk about weight cutting, typically in the days leading up to a meet, then we're referring to other changes in body mass. These are three things primarily that we can change over a number of days that can lead your weight on the scale being different without there being a change in body composition. So we can change the amount of body water that an athlete has. The most notable here is if you dehydrate someone, they weigh less. We can change how much carbohydrate is stored in their muscle or liver, and that carbohydrate is actually associated with a number of grams of water as well. And so we can have a reduction in weight through loss of glycogen. And we can also lose residue that's still in your gastrointestinal tract. So within the intestine, there can still be some undigested food that if we were to lose that, we can reduce body weight. And so we'll talk about this later on when we look at that acute weight cutting phase. Now, to start, how we should think about this, when we talk about making weight for a meet, I try to get athletes to think of this as two separate phases. So if you take this timeline here, we can see on the left, if we take the typical body weight that you would be training most of the year when, let's say, you don't have a meet coming up. So here I've put the gaintaining, to rob a phrase from Team 3DMJ. They often use this idea of gaintaining. So around kind of maintenance, maybe even a slight surplus to be gaining muscle over time. But there isn't a majorly dramatic increase in body weight, but you're supplying yourself with plenty of calories to be able to train at your maximum performance, and over time that should also probably lead to increases in muscle mass for most lifters. So most people, when they don't have a meet coming up for many, many months, will probably have a higher body weight than around the meet day competition, depending on how long you've been involved in powerlifting, of course, and that we'll talk about that a bit later on. But let's say we have this higher body weight that we're starting at. Then right on the right-hand side of this scale, you see that between the time that you take your first squat attempt and the time you weigh in, there's going to be a lag time period, and depending on what federation you compete in, this will be slightly different. So let's say you're in a federation where there's an approximate 2-hour weigh-in. That could be 2 hours, but that's typically ends up actually being a bit less, depending on, say, your lot number. You could get drawn way down. If you're the last person to weigh in, by the time you finish that weigh-in and you go and take your first squat, you actually have a lot less time than someone who obviously was first lot number. So depending on that lag time, on that weigh-in, it will impact how much weight we can cut. And we'll talk about this a bit later on, but for obvious reasons, if you're in a federation with a 24-hour period between weigh-in and the meet, then that's going to be significantly different if you have 2 hours or less between your weigh-in and when you take your first attempt. So with this kind of timeline, we can have these two distinct phases that I'll talk about. If the athlete is over their competition weight, which would be a decent percentage of athletes, they would have a higher body weight than what they compete in terms of their weight class. So between the time that they're have no meet coming up and they're just trying to gain some muscle and they're eating plenty of calories to fuel their training and just eating as much as they need to maximally perform in the gym, to the time that they're coming up close to a meet, they probably might decide to diet some body fat off to bring their body weight down. Not in all cases, but in some. So for this case, let's presume that is needed. If that happens, this would what we'd call a chronic weight loss. So a loss of weight over a extended period of time through the loss of body fat tissue. And so we'd use an energy deficit or a calorie deficit to do that. Now, that's for a long period of time. And in the previous module, we talked about how you might set up a diet to reduce body fat if that's needed for an athlete. Now, again, depending on the federation you're in and how much time you have to play around with, a number of days before your weigh-in, so this could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it is, a certain number of days out, you're going to start using some weight cutting strategies to acutely bring your weight down. So this would be in this blue shaded region here, that between that time, let's say it's a week out from your meet or 5 days out from your meet, you can use certain techniques that I'll talk about later in this module to acutely drop your weight that has nothing to do with changing how much body fat or muscle mass you have. So there are going to be some of those elements I just mentioned: body water, glycogen, gut residue, and so on. And so we can acutely drop your body weight by a certain number of kilos to allow you to drop into a weight class if necessary. So just to be aware for the moment that there's these two separate phases. So we talk about making weight or cutting weight. There's these things we have to distinguish between. So really the weight cutting strategies we hear about, like with water loading and restriction and carbohydrate restriction, those things should be used for a short period of time. Right at the end, there would be acute weight loss, whereas dieting is actually a separate thing. It's kind of this chronic weight loss that I talk about. So just to be aware of when I'm using those terms. So what this might look like in terms of your body weight is over time you might see a steady decrease during this chronic weight loss phase as you lose some body fat, so very gradually. And then in that final week, and particularly the final kind of day or so before your weigh-in, you'll have a rapid drop. So usually that kind of day before your weigh-in is where you see that biggest decrease in body weight. Then after the weigh-in, you hopefully will try and get some water back in and your body weight will come back up. So this is typically what we might see. So that's the kind of model that we're working from. Now, to start, the question becomes, well, do I need to diet? How much should I diet by? What body composition do I need? And how lean does a powerlifter need to be? So on one end, we can make a case for being lean as a powerlifter. And here I'll say relatively lean, because obviously we don't want to go to the extremes of leanness. in nearly all cases. So for example, the most extreme leanness we can get to would be the stage condition of a bodybuilder, right? That level of leanness comes at a significant cost to performance. So, and you can ask any bodybuilder on the day that they step on stage how they would be to test their 1 rep maxes. Probably not in the best shape. So we know there's some sort of limit to how lean we should be, but in general, there's probably a disadvantage that most powerlifters will have to carrying too much body fat, with the exception potentially of the super heavyweight class. For all other weight classes, there may be some sort of relative leanness there could be, and this may differ between weight classes. So it probably makes more sense that if you're competing in the lighter weight classes, you may see in general the top lifters being a bit leaner than those that are competing at much heavier weight classes. But that's not always the case, of course. So the case for being relatively lean would be a quite simple one from a physiological perspective, is that muscle is what is producing force, where in stark comparison to what body fat produces. So the more muscle that a powerlifter has, the more potential they have for force production. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the most muscle lifter will always win, because many other things go into how strong the athlete is going to be. But as you, an individual, comparing yourself to yourself, the more muscle that you have and the more muscle that you build gives you a greater potential to be able to create force. And so then with training over time, theoretically, you should be able to lift more than the version of you that has less muscle. And so for the goal for most lifters should be to get as much muscle mass as they potentially can. And then we need to find out, well, what weight class allows you, based on your frame, your genetics, your experience lifting, your level of body fat, what weight class allows you to have the most muscle you actually can without carrying too much body fat and without having to try and get up to a ridiculously high weight class that you're not going to be able to. So what is a realistic weight class that you can get to that will allow you to have the most amount of muscle will generally be a good thing. So if that's the case, a lowish amount of body fat will allow a powerlifter to maximize how much muscle they can have at a certain weight class. So again, compare two lifters of the same body weight. So they're in the same weight class, their body weight is the same, but one has more body fat, therefore they have less muscle. So the two lifters are the same weight, but one of them has more muscle on their frame because they are leaner for that given weight class, so they have a greater potential to produce force. Doesn't mean they're a better power lifter, because there's many other things that go into it, but as an individual, if they were a bit leaner and therefore were able to gain more muscle for their weight class, they would probably be better off. But like I said, beyond a certain level of leanness, it's going to be counterproductive. That just trying to maintain a really, really lean physique, and again, the extreme example I gave was with a bodybuilder, that level of leanness is going to be counterproductive to most people's overall strength performance. It's going to be counterproductive to the training workloads they can tolerate. It's going to be counterproductive to their recovery, and it's going to be counterproductive to their injury and illness risk reduction. So there's a certain level we don't want to go beyond. Now it becomes a bit tricky because that level will differ from person to person. So different powerlifters, and if you look at the top powerlifters in the world, you often will see this, that some do better when they are leaner, some do better when they actually gain even a small bit of body fat. So it's not an exact science, and certainly this isn't going to be the case for everyone, but in general, we could probably make a case that if you're carrying a lot of body fat and you're cutting weight to make a weight class, then if you're able to diet some of that body fat off and have more muscle for your weight class, you would probably be in a better position. In addition to that leanness, we know that in order to get that lean, if you have to stay in a hypocaloric diet, so in a calorie deficit for long periods of the year, in order to get lean and stay lean, and then you therefore have low energy availability, so this low amount of calories for the amount of training you're doing, that can be counterproductive to both your health and performance. So there's some middle ground that we have to work out, that we want you to be relatively lean, And what that's going to be for any individual kind of depends, but it should be something that is pretty lean, but is fairly comfortable for you to maintain and still be able to eat a decent amount of food, fuel all your training, and feel good. So most powerlifters tend to find a point as they're dieting where they get to a certain level of leanness where it's either too hard to maintain, their lifts don't feel so good, they don't feel like they're able to recover, they maybe feel a bit more susceptible to niggles. And so it may just be that they're just, number one, either under eating, and or related to that, they may be trying to keep a certain level of leanness that is not productive. And there's going to be massive inter-individual variation here. So one example that is just an obvious one that I've talked about for a couple of years is for, if we look at two people at the extremes of that. So when Lane Norton was competing in the IPF, and I think he won silver, if I remember correctly, in 2015, for him competing at the 93 kilo class, he went in there pretty damn lean for most of his powerlifting meets and performed perfectly well. That was his maximal strength at a lean body weight that allowed him to make 93. If we take an opposite example, when we had Bryce Lewis, who was one of the strongest lifters in the US when he was in the 93 kilo class, from him going up to the 105s and actually gaining some more body fat to be able to sit in around 105 or just under that, even though he had a bit more body fat now on him, his performance went through the roof and became the best lifter in the world at that weight class. And so there is inter-individual variation. Bear that in mind. And so what we're trying to say here is, in most cases, if you're carrying a lot of body fat, might be an idea to get that down a bit so you can build more muscle, or you can maybe even make a lower weight class. But don't get so lean that it makes you have to massively restrict your diet all the time, that you can eat enough food to maximally perform, and if that is preventing you from gaining more muscle. So particularly if you're a beginner or intermediate lifter and you have potential to build more muscle mass, that's probably what you should focus on. And that kind of general rule of thumb then for picking a weight class is, how much muscle can you actually build over the long term, and what weight class would allow you to do that. So with that all said, remember, when we're trying to think about either dieting or weight cuts, a lot of powerlifters make the mistake of, oh, if I do this type of nutrition strategy to cut weight and I do this type of diet, I'll be able to get down to this body weight. I'll be able to get into the weight class below what I'm currently in. So if I can already do these lifts, then I'll just be way better at this lower weight class. Often it doesn't work out that way, and people take a massive hit in performance. So remember that the goal of your nutrition is not to see how low can you get your body weight and what weight class can you cut into. It's what is the most competitive weight class for you in the long term. So many athletes might find that in the short term, if they do a big weight cut, they might get a bit better. They might not even lose that much performance, or they might. But the other big worry is when athletes go up a weight class, they say, oh, if I go up a weight class, I'm not going to be as competitive. And the problem is they're taking a very short view that probably if you do go up a weight class, in your next meet, you might not be as competitive as you are now in your current weight class. But in the long term, you may be way more competitive and be a much better powerlifter. So bear that in mind. So when coming to selecting your best weight class, how can we think about this? There's the first one, which is stick with your current weight class. So this would be if you can, if you're currently at a relatively decent body composition that you can stay gaining muscle over time, you can stay eating enough food to be able to fuel all your training and to recover, and you feel really good, you're within touching distance of your normal weight class, you don't have to cut a huge amount of weight, and you're not way underweight for your weight class, then if all those things are in place and you feel good, then the name of the game is just keep doing that. Stay at your current weight class, focusing on getting stronger, keep your body composition in check, and you're probably good. There's some other cases where you may consider moving up or down a weight class. So first, let's consider, should you move down a weight class? This might be, and again, not always, but might be a good idea or something worth investigating if you're currently carrying way too much body fat. So if you're carrying And again, how much is too much just really depends on so many factors that it's hard to give unless we're talking to a specific individual. But the athlete and the nutritionist would probably know themselves. If it's really high amount of body fat, then we can know, well, we can diet off 6-7 kilos here pretty easily, and you could be in the next weight class down, and you probably shouldn't take too much of a hit to performance because it's just all coming from body fat. So if there's a lot of body fat, it might be a candidate for a reduction in weight class. If you currently weigh in light for your current weight class, that might be an indicator again. So if you, let's say, compete in, let's say, the 93 kilo class, but you typically most of the time weigh about 86 kilos, and therefore you can eat all you want, you can drink all you want, you don't cut any weight, and you're weighing in around 86 kilos for that weight class, then you probably should make a decision of, well, I'm either going to commit to just gaining more weight for this current weight class, or maybe I can use some diet and weight cutting strategies to try and make the 83 kilo class. So just as an example, so if you weigh in light. Next is if you're an adult competitor. So this is just the converse of if you're working with a child or teenage athlete, it's probably contraindicated to be talking about going down weight classes. You want to go the opposite way, just because they're naturally going to be growing. They're naturally in the best position they're ever going to be to gain more muscle mass. And then third, there's pretty strong correlations between weight class-based sports athletes who are cutting weight and the risk of things like eating disordered or disordered behaviors around food and body composition. And so it's probably something that we should completely avoid with any underage athletes. And so it'd be my position that typically want to be encouraging them to go up weight classes as frequently as we can. So stay training, stay getting stronger, stay eating plenty of food, do not restrict your diet, stay gaining, and just keep going that. And whatever your natural body weight is, just go into that weight class. Don't cut weight. It's just not worth it for any of those younger competitors. If you're a high-level powerlifter, and this could mean, let's say, you are competing to try and win a national championship, if you compete at international level, if you are trying to place or medal at international championships, in all those cases, then doing something that is, again, slightly less than ideal from, let's say, a health standpoint or even an enjoyment standpoint, like dieting down and doing weight cutting strategies, for some athletes that might be worth the trade-off because they can win a high-level event. So the opposite of this is, again, if you are a powerlifter who is doing their first powerlifting meet or is going into local regional meets and there's nothing really to gain from placing a bit higher or lower. Instead, you should be focusing on putting up the best total you can, going into that weight class wherever you naturally sit, and don't worry about cutting weight. It really shouldn't be something that's emphasized to new lifters, beginner lifters, those that aren't really going to be seriously competitive in important meets. I just think it's not worth it. Instead, just build a better total, get stronger over time. Another candidate for going down a weight class would be there's a high potential reward for dropping a weight class. So the typical example here would be an experienced athlete that's been competing for many years. Let's say they're an international level lifter, and they've typically competed in whatever weight class they've done for a number of years. And they may, even though they're already pretty lean and already high level and maybe don't have that much body fat, they may be playing around with the idea of, well, what if I experimented with dropping a weight class? And it might be a scenario where they're maybe not going to win gold in their current weight class, but they think, if I try going down a weight class, there's a potential I can go pick up a gold medal. So for that, even though there's significant risks for that athlete to drop a weight class, it might be worth the potential payoff. And then finally, if there's an athlete who's already accumulated the majority of their potential muscle mass, so they've been training for many years, they've got lots of muscle on their frame, and they've been there's not that much more muscle they can build. Even if they stay training hard for the next 10 years, it's not going to be that much muscle. For those, it might be worth saying, okay, let's just preserve this muscle mass, let's go down a weight class. Going the opposite way of going up a weight class would be if we have an athlete who's already very lean, in addition to they're already cutting a very large amount of weight to make the weight class. And how much a large amount is, again, depends on the federation and the context. So for a 2-hour weigh-in or less, for example, then if they have to cut 5% or more of their body weight routinely and they're already really lean and it's very draining to them, and it's really taking a lot out of them, they might be a candidate to go up a weight class, because without that weight cut, they could probably still sit at the upper end of the next weight class up. So are not going to be actually outsized. Also, if the athlete has to constantly heavily restrict their food intake to stay in the current weight class, it's probably not a good idea. We probably in the long term, you're going to get much better impact of going up a weight class, taking a hit to that competitiveness maybe in the next few months, but being able to have more food more consistently, better recovery, more training volume, better progression over the next number of months and years. And then you'll probably be a better powerlifter and more competitive doing that. Also, if you have a powerlifter whose performance is typically really good in the gym, like they're smashing workouts all the time, they're pulling PRs and they're hitting beautiful sets of multiple reps, all their singles look really smooth, then they step out on the platform on meet day and they just look like a different powerlifter. If that's the case and they're cutting a decent amount of weight, you can probably put 2 and 2 together and say a lot of it is probably down to the weight cut. So it's definitely worth trying the athlete at a weight class up, and you might find that suddenly now they're the same powerlifter when they get on the platform that they are inside the gym. As I've already mentioned, if we have a teenager or child, just completely out the window for encouraging cutting weight or going down weight classes or dieting in general. All of those things should be put aside, and the focus should be on strength training and eating plenty to support that training. Similarly, if we have an athlete who has plenty of muscle to gain or is trying to gain muscle, then put them in the next weight class up, and that has a kind of goal of let's get you gaining some muscle and committing to this gaining phase. Similarly, like I've already said, if they're new to competing or just competing in local meets in a non-competitive way, and winning those doesn't really make any too much of a difference, then don't cut weight, just go up to the next weight class up. Similarly, if we have an athlete again who's beginner to intermediate and they have a potential to gain a lot more muscle mass over the next couple of years, there's not as long, like that window doesn't hang around forever. So getting up to a next weight class, again, take that hit to competitiveness in the short term, but now you're really working within that window to gain as much of this muscle. And then when you're at a pretty high level of your potential muscle mass, then you can kind of chill out, either stay in that weight class or then start thinking about cutting down. So in the previous module, we talked about dieting down if that's required. So if we have a powerlifter with too much body fat and they want to diet down in order to make weight, that was covered in the previous module. What we didn't discuss is going the other way of gaining some weight. So to keep it kind of very brief on the basic things that you should probably aim for when moving up a weight class is to take a long-term view, plan it out well in advance, and again, don't worry about your immediate competitiveness over the next number of weeks and months. Think of the long-term view. So what you might aim for. One is a increase in body weight of about 1 to 2% per month. And where you are in that range of 1 to 2% depends on a couple of things. One depends on how new you are to lifting and therefore your potential to build muscle. If we have a newer intermediate kind of lifter, then they can build muscle a bit faster than a bit more advanced lifter. And so they might be able to gain a bit faster rate. So the newer they are, and probably also chronologically, the younger they are, the faster we can kind of go with that gain of weight. The other would be the strategy you employ. So some people go for, let's say, a slower rate of weight gain. Let's presume, say 1% per month, but stay gaining consistently for many, 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 many months. Other people prefer to go a bit faster, let's say close to that 2% per month, but then within that, after every X number of weeks, they'll do a mini cut phase. So diet off for a couple of weeks, let's say after every 8 or something like that. So depending on what strategy you set up in terms of if you're going to use periods of dieting or intermittent mini cuts, then it will influence what your weight gain is, but it should probably be somewhere in this range for most people. So the idea here is to have patience and to commit to the gaining phase for several months, and really as long as you can tolerate whilst you're still gaining strength and muscle. You want a slight calorie surplus for this. So again, how much of a calorie surplus and how many calories you eat will be dependent on how is your body weight changing. If it's going up within that range of 1 to 2% per month, we're pretty good. If your body weight isn't changing at all, you need to eat more calories. If you're gaining way too much body fat, then you're probably eating too many calories. So a slight calorie surplus, maybe starting with an extra 200 or 300 calories per day for the average person. Start with that and see how you go. Again, how many extra calories will depend on your body weight, but in and around a slight surplus to start and see how you respond. Protein intake should be fairly similar to what we discussed in the previous module. Somewhere around 1.8 to 2 grams per kilo is perfectly fine. Especially the fact that you're in a calorie surplus means you probably don't need to worry about getting a huge amount extra protein because you're not going to be losing any muscle mass. And again, as we talked about in a bit more detail in the previous module, you should probably split that intake across 3 or more high protein meals, and each of those meals having at least 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, if not a bit more. So an example here, if you're an 80 kilo athlete, about 32 kilos or more of protein in at least 3 meals across the day. Accept that potential short-term dip in competitiveness. Again, you might not see this, but some athletes will, right? So if you're going up a weight class and you do a meet after 2 months, you're probably haven't had time to gain as much muscle as you would have wanted. You're probably going to be competing against people who've been in that weight class for a lot longer, who have more muscle in their frame, who are just typically bigger. So accept that, but realize that you're playing a bit of a longer game and stick with it. And then once you've gained the extra muscle and have time to adapt to this higher weight class, you'll probably be a better lifter. So give it time. So that's for moving up a weight class. So with that, we now have a situation where if you're going up a weight class, maybe you get to a point where you actually sit a bit over your weight class or just under it or whatever it is. If you typically sit under where your weight class is, and let's say you haven't moved up or down a weight class, but you sit a kilo or so under your normal weight class and you don't have to worry about weight cutting, fine. You don't need to worry about the next part. If you do sit a bit over your weight class, let's say normally you're a kilo or so over your weight class, then you'll probably have to use some of the acute weight loss strategies we're about to mention. And then if you sit quite a bit above your normal weight class, you'll have to use a combination of both dieting and losing body fat and some of the acute weight cutting strategies. So what are these acute weight cutting strategies? What ones we use and to what degree are going to depend on that lag time we have between weigh-in and your meet. So as I mentioned before, we could talk about a short, intermediate, or long lag time here. Pretty much in nearly all cases with powerlifting, we're going to have either the short lag time, which is typically 2 hours or less between your weigh-in and when the meet starts, or a long lag time where you weigh in the day before the meet. So how much you as an individual should cut kind of depends. So as I mentioned, we might see this type of graph here. So to explain this, here on the y-axis we have competitiveness. So the higher up you go on this graph, the more competitive you are. And then from left to right is how much of an acute weight cut in terms of your percentage of body weight. So how much you're going to lose, let's say, the final week of the meet. So as you can see here, By doing some of these weight cut strategies, you can probably increase your competitiveness. So as an example, let's say you as an individual compete, again, 93 kilo class. And let's compare if you were to typically sit at 91 kilos and not cut any weight versus if you typically go into that final week and you sit at 94 kilos and have to cut a kilo of body weight to make 93, then you as an individual in those two cases, there's 3 kilos in the difference. So potentially you may have 3 kilos more muscle. It's not actually going to be 3 kilos of muscle. Some of it will be muscle, some will be the glycogen in that muscle, some will be the water in that muscle and other things. But let's say you have X amount of kilos of extra lean body mass. Now, theoretically, at least, you might be better off. However, like we said, going beyond that and cutting more and more weight, you're going to have more and more performance decrements. And as you can see with this graph, pretty quickly, they will rapidly go down. So many of you have probably experienced this before. If you try to cut a significant amount of weight and you go into the meet and you feel absolute shit and you can't perform properly. This is typically from too large of an acute weight cut. Now, we might, in a moment, I will give some suggested targets. So this red line, that's presumed that's like the general recommendations I'm going to give, which again, as the name suggests, is just general, that for a lot of people will work, but it's not specific to any one person. Some people might be better doing a bit more. Some people might be doing a bit less. So you as an individual athlete will be somewhere along here where you might do better cutting, let's say, 4% of your body weight in that final week, whereas other people, or you might be an athlete who actually performs best when they have 0 to cut. So again, if you're a 93 kilo athlete, you just maintain a body composition of around 92 to 93 kilos. And so you're hovering in around 93 kilo, right on the limit, and then just barely maybe just cut down on some of your water and food in the hours leading up to the weigh-in. You make weigh-in and you've basically cut 0 weight and you perform your best at that. So knowing where you perform best will take a bit of trial and error. Now, with the change in body mass, so these are the primary ways we're going to cut down on some of these. First, we'll talk about gut residue, because this is the best place to start, because reducing the amount of gut residue you have will allow you to lose weight on the scale, but will have 0 downside for your performance. So that's why it's the first go-to thing you should do. So by using a low residue diet for between 1 to 3 days, we can see a considerable drop in body weight, depending on your normal fiber intake. So to clarify, a low residue diet is essentially a low fiber diet. So you would take out things that are like fibrous vegetables, you would take out whole grains, you would take out, let's say, brown bread, and you'd have instead something like white bread. So basically reduce fiber intake in the diet. The less fiber you have, then you're not going to have that fiber sitting in the intestine, because fiber will tend to hang around the intestine for a bit, and that obviously carries some weight. So the less you have in there, the less weight that there's going to be. So if you have a pretty high fiber intake, usually you can lose somewhere around 1 to even 1.5% of your body weight just through a low residue diet. If you don't have that much fiber, it's probably going to be a lot less. So for the average kind of powerlifter who's eating plenty of plant material, we can lose about 1% or more of their body weight just through going on a low fiber diet for 2 to 3 days, and it's not going to impact their powerlifting performance at all. So it's kind of a good place to go. In combination with the low fiber diet, we can also aim to have a minimal amount of food weight in their system in the hours leading into weigh-in. So this would be, let's say, the day before or the day of, having foods that are of low actual weight. So if you're to weigh that food on a scale, for the amount of calories you're getting from it, it's actually pretty low. So that's why you might have some calorie dense foods. So let's say in this case, you could have an athlete consume a couple of tablespoons of peanut butter. It will give them a large whack of calories, so they don't have to be completely low in calories, but there's going to be virtually very little weight within that. You could have a fasting window that's extended. So this would be, let's say you're going to weigh in on Saturday morning. Then your previous meal on Friday evening, so your last meal of the day, you might bring that earlier in the evening. So instead of eating a meal at 7 p.m., you can instead have your last meal at 4 p.m. That gives a longer fasting window before you're going to have your weigh-in. There's more time for that undigested food to move through your intestinal tract, and so it may help. So these are a few things that can reduce the amount of residue in the gut. Other thing people play around with is things like using laxatives and so on. Number one, don't ever use prescription laxatives, just dangerous, contraindicated. For other kind of more over-the-counter or even herbal kind of laxative uses, maybe they could be worth taking it like a few days before the meat, I would say. Definitely don't take it the day before for obvious reasons, but a couple of days before, as you're about to start that low residue diet, maybe you could take that, help you go to the bathroom, and then you start the low residue diet, and hopefully that allows to do it. And obviously with the low fiber diet, keep that to the recommended 1 to 3 days. Any longer than that is going to be problematic for obviously constipation or something like that, which is kind of counterproductive to what we're aiming for. So once you've done the low fiber diet, if there's still more that the athlete would need to lose, we could look at the amount of carbohydrate they store in their muscle and liver in the form of glycogen. So very briefly, we could look at kind of the math behind how much glycogen is possible for an athlete to lose. We have, for every 1 gram of glycogen you can store in your muscle and liver, you also store 3 grams of water along with that. We've seen quite reliably on low carbohydrate diets, so let's say less than 50 grams per day for several days would allow you to drop 1 to 2% of your body weight. And the amount of glycogen depends on how much muscle mass you have. So the more muscle you have, the more capacity you have to store glycogen in that muscle, for example. And just doing some kind of typical math of the glycogen you can store in your liver and the average amount in muscle mass, using these kind of rough numbers, if we were to take the example of a 75 kilo powerlifter, with 60 to 65% of their weight being muscle mass, which would probably be typical for a strength athlete. Using those numbers we mentioned, they could probably at most store around 462 grams of glycogen. And again, if there's around 3 grams plus of water, we could have an extra few kilos of bound water to that. And so we could lose between 2 and 4 kilos of body weight in that athlete with complete glycogen depletion. Now, for a powerlifter competing in a 2-hour or less weigh-in, for example, complete glycogen depletion is probably not a good idea. Simply, there's not going to be enough time between the weigh-in and when you squat to restore glycogen. Now, you could also make the point, well, powerlifting, particularly a 1 rep, isn't actually dependent on glycogen, which is true. However, there's probably something about carbohydrate availability and being completely glycogen depleted from a sensory perspective that the body can detect that may limit performance. Also, it'll be a situation that you're not used to lifting in that condition. You're never going to be training with depleted glycogen, and so it's probably not a good idea to completely deplete glycogen for a short weigh-in like this. So we would definitely do glycogen depletion if you compete in a federation with 24-hour plus weigh-ins. If you compete on a same day weigh-in, then I wouldn't go full-on glycogen depletion, but we can do slightly lowered carbohydrate intake. So as an example, if we were to take a powerlifter who usually consumes 300 grams of carbohydrate, here in the red bars, we'd see if they have 24 hours or more between the weigh-in and meet. Yellow would be somewhere in between, and the green would be a short lag time, so 2 hours or less. You can see for that typical 2-hour weigh-in, we might, for most of the time, keep their normal carbohydrate intake up where it usually is. And then for the last couple of days, we might drop it to 2/3 or half of what it normally is, and then not have much before the weigh-in itself. And so we'd have this slight reduction in carbohydrate. They might lose some glycogen stores if they do some light training. They might lose some water along with it, but we're not really trying to lose that much body weight through glycogen depletion. Now, you could probably make a case, it depends on how far away from the weight class you are. If we have those athletes who need to cut more weight, and I've certainly worked with these, we can definitely do more radical carbohydrate restriction the week of the meet and go low carb all week long and lose more weight. And many lifters actually do pretty okay with that. Others don't do so well. So this would be something I would test. If you've never done this, then the easiest way to do it is if you have a training block, and let's say you have a day where you work up to a heavy single perhaps, then maybe if you have a deload week or something where your performance doesn't matter as much, you could do a carbohydrate restriction week and then have like a fake weigh-in and then have some carbohydrates after that, and then an hour and a half later go and work up to a heavy single on your squat. And you can see how you feel. And if you know that you just feel terrible with carbohydrate restriction, might not be a good idea. If you do perfectly fine, then you might be someone who's able to cut carbohydrates for the week of the meet. So let's say you put it at between 50 and 100 grams per day for the week of the meet, cut that glycogen down, and you actually perform perfectly fine. So there's no one right answer here. So I'd say test out first, and err on the side of keeping some carbohydrate in, but reducing it a small amount. But if you do need to cut more weight, it's certainly an option that you can do to go full carbohydrate restriction, like to 50 grams or less for the week. That will allow you to cut more weight if you do so. But just bear in mind, it may or may not work out okay. So with that, then the final thing that most athletes will look at is body water. This can be done from restricting water intake. One thing that goes alongside that kind of dehydration that we use from water restriction is to use a water loading period. So there's kind of a couple of ways to do this. The top here in the red you see would be to have 3 days or so of a high water intake. So this would be 100 milliliters of water for every kilogram of your body weight. So if you are 80 kilos, that would correlate to about 8 liters of fluid per day for those 3 days. And then on the final day, so this would be the day before your meet, you would have a water restriction day where you'd cut your water down to about maybe 15 mils per kilo. So pretty low. So it might be about a liter or so of fluid, maybe a bit less depending on your body weight. And so it's going to be a considerable drop off. And water loading in this manner, so the 3 high water loading days actually will lead to more water loss on the water restriction day, as shown by work out of the Australian Institute of Sport when Reid Reel was lead author on a paper that looked at water loading. So that would be a way to do it. Water load for 3 days, have a restriction day for 1, and then the next day is going to be your meet. So those numbers again would be, for the water loading is 100 milliliters for every kilogram of your body weight, and the restriction day would be about 15 milliliters for every kilogram of your body weight. The other thing we could look at is potentially sodium and salt. So from one paper at least, we see in this study, they took people, got them at what we call sodium balance. So found at what intake of sodium was their excretion of sodium, so say through sweat and other means, about the same. So here they put them on this high salt diet, which is on the left column here, and the sodium balance is around 0. So meaning the amount of sodium going in was the same as the amount going out. Then they put them on this very low salt diet. So you see it's very low, it's 10 instead of 200. 24 hours of that very low salt intake, you see that they're in negative sodium balance. The same after 48 hours, but about 5 to 7 days of low salt diet, they were back at sodium balance, which means your body is adapting to that lower sodium intake and starts excreting or getting rid of less and less sodium. So sodium restriction or salt restriction is probably only going to be worthwhile to do for, let's say, 1 to 2 days. Also, there could be negatives and health consequences to restricting sodium. So for that reason, again, keeping it to about 1 to 2 days, which just lines up with what you're doing over the course of the week. If you're doing water loading and then restriction, on that final day or two, maybe before you weigh in, you're just going to have a lower sodium intake. So just be aware of salty foods or adding salt to foods or processed foods that have a lot of salt in them. Try and get low salt versions or foods that are typically naturally low in sodium. So you can use a combination of that salt and the water loading and restriction to lose water weight. And ideally, we wouldn't want to have to resort to saunas or induced sweating or so on. If it's a 24-hour plus weigh-in, they can be used. And I'm happy to take questions about that if people are doing it. If you're doing a 2-hour or less weigh-in, then really if you're relying on cutting a lot of weight in a sauna, it may be something to think about. Are you doing everything else right in terms of the nutrition stuff we've gone through today? And should you be in the weight class you're in? You might say yes, but I would say it's worth thinking about those questions first of all. Are you doing all these other strategies we've talked about first? Are you getting lean enough? Are you using the low residue diet? Are you doing all that type of stuff? And then if you still need to cut a lot of weight using a sauna on top of that, it might be worth thinking about, would you actually be better going up a weight class? So worth considering, but not necessarily always wrong. I should also note that that's the more that you're going to dehydrate, and when you start using tactics like saunas and hot baths to cut a considerable amount of weight, and you only have 2 hours or less before you perform, there's more and more health risks. And so it becomes contraindicated, and it's hard to kind of recommend doing any of those types of things. So please be aware of that. So with all that, how do we boil this into some actual targets that you can use? First, if it's less than 2 hours, I would say for most powerlifters, cutting between 0 and 3% of their body weight in those final, let's say, 5 days or so. So the week of the meet, somewhere between 0 and 3% for most is probably good. Like I said, it'll be 0 for people who naturally sit just in around their weight class or a bit under. They just don't cut weight, obviously. For other people who are new to powerlifting, who are not going to be really competitive and are just trying to get better and build a total, then yeah, just don't cut weight, go in the next weight class up. If you're going to do some sort of mild weight cut, and let's say you naturally sit about a kilo or so over your weight class, fine. You can cut, like I say, up to about 3% using a low residue diet, which could be 1 to 1.5%, using some slight reduction in carbohydrate, cut off your mealtime a bit earlier the previous day, and some very mild reduction in water should probably easily get you to that kind of 2-3% mark without much hassle. For other people, they can probably quite easily do 4 or 5% and be fine. But typically these are people that have experience doing it and also need to do it, right? They're already lean, they're competing at high levels, and they need to try and get that performance benefit. So when we're working with athletes, we can definitely get some of them there. But I think most people would probably be best in that, like at that range of 0 to 3%. For 24 hours, I think 8% is really quite doable without any real risk to health. Some people will do a lot more. I think at a certain point it becomes not only a safety issue, but also counterproductive for performance. And again, the question would be, are you in the right weight class? But for certain individuals, just individually, they respond better, and let's say they can do 10%. Someone else, 8% would be way too much, and they might feel way better just doing 4% or 3%. But I think up to around 8%, I'm comfortable with someone who has 24 hours or more using some of the strategies I've talked about. The context around all these things, these are just rough, arbitrary numbers. These are not prescriptions exactly for everyone. These are rough numbers based on these things. 1, individual response. You may do better cutting less weight than I've recommended here. You might do better being able to cut a bit more. I don't know. but these are generally rules. You might have to cut a lot less weight or no weight at all in order to be able to perform well. And I know people who just can't cut any weight without feeling negative, whether that's psychological or otherwise. Your habitual carbohydrate and fiber intake. If you are typically on a very low carbohydrate diet, and your fiber intake is also not very high, then you won't be able to use the same degree of these weight cuts as I've just mentioned, because when it comes to using some carbohydrate restriction or using a low fiber diet, they will not have any impact if you're normally on a low fiber intake or you have a low carbohydrate intake. So bear that in mind. So if you're a fan of eating a ketogenic diet, for example, that's perfectly fine, but bear in mind you won't be able to cut as much weight in those final few days as someone who eats lots of carbohydrates and then suddenly cuts those out for a few days. For that reason that you're just not losing the same degree of glycogen and water, probably, if you normally don't have as much around. Now, you may be able to do that, but again, that's kind of some nuance that we need to get into some Q&A about. Your amount of muscle mass. The more muscle mass you have, the more ability you have to store carbohydrate and water, so you can cut more weight. Your level of competition. I've said this a few times. If you're new to competing, just don't cut weight. It's not worth it. It's just not a good idea. If you are competing at very high levels where a couple of percent makes all the difference and whether you medal or not, then it could be worth cutting weight and cutting a decent amount of weight. So it just depends. Or it could blow up in your face and go the other way. So level of competition simply meaning if you're not at a really, really high level, I just wouldn't worry about this most of the times if you're not aiming to win something. More experienced lifters are typically going to do better with weight cuts because they've done it before, they've tested it, they know how they respond, they know what foods to eat, they aren't as stressed out and anxious about it, and those things can help with water retention. So experience plays a big role, and this includes testing it out in training. And then also your age. If you are, like I said, underage, don't do it. And don't advise youth athletes to be cutting weight typically. So once you've made weight, the next thing is the refueling window. Very briefly, some things to bear in mind. Again, this will depend on how much weight you've cut and whether it's 24-hour or 2-hour weigh-in. Rehydration is the obvious one. Get fluids back in, get water back in, rehydrate at a regular schedule, let's say about a liter of fluid per hour. If you've gone on that low sodium intake for a couple of days, make sure you're getting some sodium particularly, as well as some other electrolytes back in to the system. If you've cut a lot of carbohydrate out the week of the event, then it might be worth including some carbohydrate powder, say in a drink after you've weighed in, to get some carbohydrates back in your system. If you've cut completely depleted glycogen in a 24-hour weigh-in, then yeah, you want to eat plenty of carbohydrates over the next 24 hours before the meet to really fully restore your glycogen levels. Energy availability is just about getting some more calories back in. So this is just eating pretty something that has plenty of calories before you're going to go and compete, or just over the course of the day. And I'll mention that in a moment. Other things to consider: creatine may be worth consuming, particularly if you've taken it out to make weight. So some people remove creatine because creatine holds onto some water. If you've done that, it might be worth taking some. It might not really have any impact, so I wouldn't overly worry about creatine. Caffeine, we'll talk about in a moment, certainly can play a role on meet day. GI comfort, this would be about, don't start having supplements and foods that you don't usually have and you don't know how you respond to. This is surprisingly common with people who start having supplements and foods and meals that they never usually have before training, and suddenly on meet day they start eating this stuff. They feel sick, they feel overly bloated, they feel too heavy, and they just don't feel right lifting. So be aware of those foods, eat foods you're used to having. And then the same as routine. Try and eat foods and meals in the same way that you usually do going into big training sessions. So what types of foods do you eat that day? What do you bring with you before you go and train? What do you have in between training sessions? What foods do you know you tolerate well? What is part of your normal routine? They're some of the main aims. Now, final thing before we close up is meet day nutrition. try and keep it very basic here because there's many different ways that suit people's preferences. Things I typically recommend to lifters: one is to bring plenty of quote unquote light snacks or meals. So this would be stuff that just isn't that, again, quote unquote heavy, that really makes you feel full, weighed down, whatever. A lot of people don't like that sensation. And so have plenty of, because you can't sometimes know the running of a meet and if it's going to go smoothly, if you're going to be waiting around for ages, if you're going to be called quicker, if someone's going to drop out of the flight and now your turn is coming around a bit quicker than you thought. Because of all these things, you probably don't want to have like massive heavy meals and then maybe go and have to lift quicker than you thought. So instead, I would recommend bringing a multiple number of smaller, lighter snacks that you can keep grazing on constantly. But then if you are called at short notice or something happens, or maybe the meet gets delayed, you can have extra meals or whatever it is. You can just be able to pick and choose based on that, as opposed to going out with something really heavy and you feel just not so great. Same reason, make it easy to digest. It should be a food you eat regularly, that you know you tolerate well, that digests easily and doesn't make you feel sluggish or anything like that. Probably most people will do better with having some carbohydrates in their system. And just even if this isn't carbohydrate that you digest and gets turned into glucose or into glycogen immediately, because that takes a certain period of time, just having more glucose in your system for most people will have the benefit of them feeling good and can have benefits both psychologically and physiologically. Next is to be wary of gastrointestinal distress, and I've already mentioned this, of just getting foods that you're used to consuming. And then we have caffeine dosing and distribution. So in the previous module, I actually talked about caffeine doses, somewhere around 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of your body weight. It seems to be where we get that ergogenic effect. And with caffeine dosing on meet day, you're probably going to take some about 45 minutes or so before you're due to squat. But because of how powerlifting meets are set up, you're probably going to have some caffeine throughout the day because there's many hours that you're going to be there. And we obviously want to keep caffeine levels up in the bloodstream. And this distribution across a meet probably is a generally good thing. And there's some areas of endurance sports where they will actually purposely have doses split across many hours to keep caffeine high in the bloodstream. So the thing to bear in mind is have that initial high dose at the start, if you feel good on caffeine, that is. And then you can keep that topped up with relatively smaller amounts, either in caffeinated beverages or so on, depending how you feel. Now, if you're someone who usually doesn't consume caffeine, then it's probably not a good idea to go in and have a huge amount of caffeine on meet day when you never take it otherwise, and then you're unaware of how you react to it. So have this tested out, tested in training, see how much caffeine tends to get you a benefit, and then how you would stagger that across the day. So keeping those dosages that we mentioned previously in mind. So let's get to a summary of what we've discussed today. First of all, we talked about picking a weight class. And the big question you have to ask is, at what weight can I have the most amount of muscle whilst not having too much body fat? And what too much body fat is different for each person. So there's obviously differences between the sexes. There's differences between if you're a lightweight versus a heavyweight lifter. There's differences in just how you respond to a usual level of leanness. There are some people that comfortably walk around at 10% body fat. For someone else, it might be 15% that they naturally feel best at. So at what level of body fat is not too much body fat, but that you can eat plenty, recover from training, feel really good, have good performance? At what body composition of that level of leanness can you build the most amount of muscle? And whatever weight class that ends up being, that's probably the one to aim for, with the long-term goal of what is the highest weight class I can get into based on increasing muscle. Second, we talked about you can make weight in 2 different phases. One of those longer term chronic changes in body composition. The other is those acute changes in actually cutting weight. From a perspective of how much weight to cut, a couple of different factors here. The two primary ones are how much time you have between the weigh-in and the meet. And then the second is your individual reaction as an athlete. But there are other things that I mentioned as well in terms of competitiveness, age, and all that other type of stuff. Next, for a less than 2 hour lag time between your weigh-in and competing, probably somewhere between 0 to 3% of an acute cut is best for most lifters. Some will do perfectly fine with more. And again, the cases where you'd probably take that risk of going a bit more would be for certain types of people at elite levels, for example, and it still not may work out. For other people, cutting 0% will give them the best actual performance. And so maybe going into a higher weight class and not cutting weight works for that athlete. For a different athlete, they might be better off cutting a small amount of weight, a couple of percent, and getting into a weight class below or somewhere in this range. But this is a general guideline for most lifters, and where you are along this range should again depend on those factors I mentioned earlier: your level of competition, your experience, your competitiveness, your current body composition, how many times you've done this, and your natural individual reaction to cutting weight. And some people do better with weight cuts, some people not. So here's a kind of good starting point. Next, on meet day, we mentioned about the goals are to restore fluid, electrolytes, and carbohydrates as needed. So depending on if you've depleted any of those or not. And then in terms of foods across the day, pick foods that you know you tolerate well, that you're used to eating, you've consumed regularly in and around training sessions, and you know how you react to them. Aim for ones that feel lighter, so to speak, probably have some carbohydrates, and I'd probably kind of stay away from ones that are really heavy or make you feel full, if that's not a sensation you enjoy lifting with. Other people actually do, particularly for something like the bench press. Some people actually aim for that. So again, know how you as an individual react. So that is it. I hope this has been useful, and that is our lesson for today. I've been Danny Lennon, and I hope you have learned something here. So take care.